Iran's president promises to retaliate after he blamed Israel for a missile strike in Damascus that killed 5 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. And in Iraq, an Iran-backed militia claimed responsibility for an attack on the Al-Assad air base that injured several U.S. personnel. Joining me now is Washington Post columnist and the author of Chaos Under Heaven, Josh Rogin. Josh, good to see you again. So I said the risk of the war in Gaza triggering a wider regional conflict, attacks by the Houthis and Hezbollah and Islamic resistance, U.S. service members injured, IRGC members killed. Is that conflict here now?
Well, Victor, yes, I think it is here, and I think it has been here for several weeks, if not months. 140 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria since the Israel-Gaza war began. That averages out to more than one a day, and now we see the retaliations by the American and Israeli forces getting larger and larger, and the re-retaliation getting larger and larger. No, it hasn't expanded into a full-out war between the United States and Iran. That is what I think all sides are trying to avoid. But with these latest missile strikes, the attacks on U.S. forces that are resulting in multiple injuries, we can see that this is slowly but surely getting much, much worse. And neither side knows where the other side's red lines are. Neither side has a perfect understanding of how to contain this. And therein lies the danger, not in that Washington or Tehran really wants to go to war, but that a miscalculation or a mistake could lead to that very outcome.
Yeah, trying to avoid this direct U.S.-Iran war, but one would expect there would be some retaliation against the Islamic resistance for the attack that injured U.S. service members. The Washington Post at least reporting that there will be now some sustained campaign against the Houthis since the strikes against them to stop these attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea, the president acknowledges has not worked. Just detail the fine line that this administration will have to walk to degrade capabilities without setting off that full-fledged war.
Right. I think there are two things. I think inside the administration, there is a debate over whether or not to attack sites inside of Iran. Right now, the president hasn't decided to go that far, but that would be the next step. That's what happened a few years ago when, if you remember, after the United States killed the Iranian leader, Qasem Soleimani, there were retaliations and re-retaliations, and we almost struck inside of Iran, but it didn't happen. So I think that's one big line that everyone's waiting to see if the Biden administration is going to cross. The other thing is that there's no reason to expect that this cycle of retaliation and re-retaliation will end before the war in Gaza ends. And while the Biden administration likes to say that these two things aren't connected, it's obvious to everyone, including the Israelis and the Iranians and the Houthis and the American troops there, that of course it is connected, because the reason that the Iranians have activated all of these proxy forces is to pressure the Americans, to pressure the Israelis to cut down on the violence in Gaza. So without a policy change, either in Washington or in Israel, that turns to some sort of path to resolving the violence in Gaza, there's going to be no way to stop the violence that is precipitating throughout the region.
Is this strike in Damascus that happened yesterday that ended with the deaths of several leaders of the IRGC, is that a part of this continuous simmer, or does that escalate the series of attacks back and forth that we've seen involving Iran and Iranian-backed groups?
I think it is an escalation, and it's again, everyone's trying to escalate just a little bit, but who knows what a little bit of an escalation really means. And when you're striking inside of foreign countries, you have to risk retaliation by that country and by the country that owns the people that you just killed. So yes, there's going to be politics inside Syria, politics inside Lebanon, where Israeli forces struck inside of Beirut just a couple of weeks ago, politics inside of Iraq. The Iraqi government has no desire to see American forces and Iranian-backed forces having a proxy war on their territory either. So yes, every strike escalates, and every strike makes this even more complicated and even more dangerous. And that's why one would think that diplomacy would have to get involved here. But right now the conditions there for that just don't exist.
Let's turn toward Ukraine now. And President Zelensky, he spoke with Britain's Channel 4 and spoke specifically about former President Trump's assertion that he would be able to end Putin's war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Here's what President Zelensky said.
When he himself says, I will end the war in 24 hours, it seems to me, how do I put this, very dangerous what he says. I will explain. He will make decisions on his own, without, I'm not even talking about Russia, but without both sides.
Now, Zelensky also said that, this could be electioneering. He's just saying what he needs to say to get elected. But what you heard there from Zelensky, any reason to believe he's wrong about that assessment?
No, I actually agree with Zelensky. I think Trump's rhetoric is reckless and dangerous. And if he were to become president again, there's no telling what he would do. Already, we see President Trump working with his allies in Congress to try to kill the Ukraine aid. That's what's happening right now in Washington. The MAGA people are trying to scuttle the immigration Ukraine negotiation that's going on in the Senate. And that's even before he's president again. So, I think if I was Zelensky, I'd be very, very worried about a Trump presidency, not just because he might do what he says he's going to do, which is try to force some resolution in 24 hours, which could only be achieved on the backs of the suffering of lots and lots of Ukrainians, but because you don't know what he's going to say tomorrow or the next day, which could be totally different. And that kind of uncertainty and risk is the last things that the Ukrainians need as they fight for their survival. But at the same time, Zelensky's got to be coming to terms with the fact that that might be something he can't avoid. He might have to deal with President Trump again. And if you remember the last time he had to deal with President Trump, it didn't go that well for either Zelensky or President Trump. But, that's the problem with history. If we don't learn from it, we're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, first impeachment. Josh Rogin, thanks so much.
All right, coming up, former President Trump is expected to be back in a New York City courtroom tomorrow for the E. Jean Carroll defamation case. Will he take the stand?